we need to talk about Russia, Ukraine, and Donald Trump upending decades of US foreign policy through official comments, offhand comments, and rambling falsehood-filled social media posts. Because earlier this week, we talked about how the US started talks with Russia about ending the war in Ukraine without inviting Ukraine. And this is Trump also reportedly demanded 50% of Ukraine's mineral wealth as repayment for past military aid and not in exchange for any sort of security guarantee. Within all of that, spurring European powers to start working on a massive new military aid package for Ukraine, as well as discussing the possibility of contributing peacekeepers to back any deal on Ukraine, right? Something Russia quickly said it would not accept. But in just a couple of days since then, Trump has fully flipped the script, blaming Ukraine's leaders for Russia's invasion and suggesting they may not deserve a seat at the table at all. With that, then setting the stage for what experts are saying might be one of the country's most consequential shifts in foreign relations ever. So starting Tuesday, you had Trump speaking to reporters and sounding as if he had just found that people died during war, but somehow also not understanding how the invading forces would bear responsibility.
Russia wants to do something. They want to stop the savage barbarianism. I mean, what's going on over there? It's soldiers are being killed by the thousands on a weekly basis. It's ridiculous. And they're not American soldiers. They're Russian soldiers and they're Ukrainian soldiers largely, although a lot of Koreans have been killed, as you know.
And from there, you had Trump bashing Zelensky and claiming that the Ukrainian president's approval rating had dropped to 4%, something that is not only grossly untrue, Zelensky has a better approval rating in his country than Donald Trump has here right now. But finally, here, you had Trump addressing the issue of Ukraine being excluded from the opening round of negotiations and seemingly outright blaming the country's leaders for the war.
But today I heard, oh, well, we weren't invited. Well, you've been there for 3 years. You should have ended it 3 years. You should have never started it. You could have made a deal. I could have made a deal for Ukraine that would have given them almost all of the land, everything, almost all of the land, and no people would have been killed, and no city would have been demolished, and not one dome would have been knocked down. But they chose not to do it that way.
Right, and then with all of that, yesterday Trump just doubled down and went even further, with Trump posting on Truth Social claiming that the US spent $350 billion on aid to Ukraine, $200 billion more than Europe, and alleging that Zelensky admits that half of the money sent is missing, with him then even calling Zelensky a dictator without elections and warning he better move fast or he's not going to have a country left. And finally saying, I love Ukraine, but Zelensky has done a terrible job, his country is shattered, and millions have unnecessarily died. With then, last night, Trump tripling down on his comments while speaking to investors and executives in Miami, again calling Zelensky a dictator and suggesting the Ukrainian president wanted to prolong the war to keep the gravy train going, referring to American military aid. And Trump then finally speaking to BBC on Air Force One and saying that Russia has the cards in Ukraine peace negotiations. So there we saw some countering saying, well, yeah, of course, because you stack the deck for them. Or with people pointing to the numerous things that are just not true being said by Trump about the war in Ukraine over the past few days. Things like, for example, his claims about how much America has spent supporting Ukraine and how it spent way more than Europe. That is just false, because it is absolutely possible to arrive at a few different numbers depending on how you count it, but there's seemingly no basis for the $350 billion number. With one reliable estimate, for example, putting the total value of military, financial, and humanitarian aid actually allocated to Ukraine by the US at around $119 billion. And this is the number for Europe, including both EU and non-EU countries. It's around $138 billion. And then, as far as Zelensky and the so-called missing money, that's actually a bit of misinformation that's been floating around ever since he said in an interview a few weeks ago that Ukraine had only actually received about $76 billion in aid from the US and that he didn't know where the rest of it was. And that's not in reference to money getting disappeared. That's him making a point about how Ukraine doesn't actually get a lot of the money that people think they do, or with most of it actually being spent in the US, largely going to American weapons manufacturers. Then, as far as Zelensky's 4% approval rating, well, I made a mention of it. As far as the specific numbers we have, one recent poll, for example, showed that 57% of Ukrainians trust Zelensky, and while that figure is lower than it was at the outset of the war, it's up from 52% in December. And that, notably, is Trump's approval rating is dipping here and is now down to about 44% according to one of the latest polls. But then, next up, let's talk about the idea that Zelensky is actually a dictator without elections. Well, first of all, Zelensky won the presidency in a landslide victory in 2019, and, it is true, his 5-year term was originally scheduled to end in 2024. But notably, under their country's constitution, an election cannot be held while martial law is in force, or with the rationale sort of being that holding an election would be a logistical nightmare when you have Russian missiles raining down on the country. And this is you have election experts saying that any vote held during wartime would effectively disenfranchise voters living in Russian-occupied areas, those who have fled the country as refugees and soldiers in combat. But with that said, I will note there is some real concern about the suspension of elections in the country. And that includes from within Ukraine, where, for example, the mayor of Kyiv is among the officials who have accused Zelensky's office of abusing its powers. And this also as some of Ukraine's allies have pressured the country to move forward with elections despite the issues. But really, either way, it's not only inaccurate, but it is a pretty fucking wild criticism to levy against Zelensky when the guy on the other side of the situation is Vladimir Putin, or someone who has effectively ruled Russia for 25 years, rigging elections and amending amending the Constitution to extend his rule. But of course, probably the biggest, most shocking, fucking dumbest, most offensive claim is that Ukraine is at fault for this war. Right? There is zero doubt that Russia started the war by invading Ukraine. There is no amount of, when you're famous, they let you do it, just close your eyes, look away, what dress were you wearing, excuses that puts away the seriousness of the situation and what actually happened. Right, back in 2014, Putin annexed Crimea and backed militants taking over the Donbass region in eastern Ukraine. And in 2022, almost exactly 3 years ago, he launched a full-scale invasion with the aim of toppling Zelensky's pro-Western government in Kyiv. Right, the Russian military attacked from the east and north, including from neighboring Belarus as well as from Russian-occupied Crimea. That attack started the biggest conflict in Europe since World War II. And since then, Russian firepower has leveled whole cities and killed more than 12,000 Ukrainian civilians, according to the United Nations. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers have also been killed and wounded, and Russian soldiers have committed atrocities, with the ICC even accusing Putin of war crimes and issuing a warrant for his arrest along with other senior Russian officials. And so with all of this, we've seen Zelensky hit back against Trump's comments, claiming that the US president is trapped in a disinformation bubble and saying, I would like to see more truth from the Trump team. We've seen this disinformation. We understand it comes from Russia. Unfortunately, President Trump, and we have great respect for him as a leader of people we also respect very much, he lives in this disinformation space, which then resulted in Vice President Vance criticizing Zelensky for so-called bad-mouthing Trump and warning it's an atrocious way to work with the US. Because you know how, like, when someone calls you a dictator and you're like, hey, that's not nice, you're the asshole. But with all of that, we saw the Kremlin essentially echoing what Vance said. Right, a Kremlin spokesperson saying Zelensky made inadmissible remarks about other world leaders and adding, the rhetoric of Zelensky and many representatives of the Kyiv regime leaves much to be desired. The fact that Zelensky's rating is falling is an absolutely obvious trend. With the Kremlin then also saying today it absolutely agreed with Trump on Ukraine and is ready to resume dialogue with the United States on all parameters of the war. And of course, with that, they may be eager to negotiate with the United States and not others because the concessions that Trump and his team have suggested Ukraine might have to take, it's reading like a Russian wish list. Or reportedly, they would get to keep all Ukrainian territory it illegally seized by force. NATO membership would be off the table for Ukraine, and the US can't provide any security guarantee. Additionally, sanctions against Russia might be lifted, and Trump has even suggested that Russia be readmitted to the G7, which it was expelled from for its original 2014 incursion into Ukraine. And all of this, as it appears that the only thing they'd be asking of Putin is that the Kremlin halt the fighting. Right? As of filming, Trump has not highlighted any other concessions that he would insist on. And that is, Trump has also not said how Putin can actually be trusted to keep an agreement, given that he violated a 1994 pact guaranteeing Ukrainian sovereignty, as well as 2 ceasefire deals negotiated in 2014 and 2015. Right? And so all of that taken together is why we've seen this called a remarkable moment in US foreign policy and a seismic shift. With, for example, the likes of the Washington Post claiming this head-spinning move away from decades of US policy toward Russia may lead to the most significant geopolitical realignment since World War II. And the New York Times explaining Trump is in the middle of executing one of the most jaw-dropping pivots in American foreign policy in generations, a 180-degree turn that will force friends and foes to recalibrate in fundamental ways. And I want to be clear, these are not value statements. Right? Well, I have my own opinions. I'm not saying whether it's going to be good or bad, just that it is significant. Right? To Trump and his allies, this pivot may be seen as a necessary change to a policy that they have long viewed as being misguided. Right? With them thinking that the cost of defending Europe, it's just too high and resources would be better spent countering China. So there, I will say, this has not been the dominant view of even Republicans, with us now even sort of seeing the GOP splitting on the approach to Ukraine, though none really speaking out strongly against Trump specifically. But in any case, we're already seeing the potential impact of this in Europe. Or with us seeing Politico, for example, talking about a new Western crisis coalition forming to basically develop a Ukraine policy separate from the US. Right? And notably, NATO would normally be the go-to place to discuss this issue, but these countries are meeting outside of that or any other existing venue. Or with that excluding the US as well as NATO countries like Hungary and Slovakia that are generally seen as more sympathetic to Putin. And notably here, European politics and European support for Ukraine, I mean, that could be getting a shakeup this weekend thanks to the German election. Because Germany is a leading member of NATO as well as the second biggest weapon supplier to Ukraine after the US. But there, the far-right party, one which has been backed by Elon Musk, they appear to be heading towards their strongest result ever. Right? And they are a pro-Russian party that supported ending aid to Ukraine. And of course, all of this is playing out as the actual war is still happening. But for now, we'll have to wait to see what continues to happen on the ground and also what happens with international politics connected to it. Hey, thanks for watching, and I hope you enjoyed this clip from the full Philip DeFranco show. And also, a big thanks to Squarespace for sponsoring our Clips channel. Turn your passion into profit over at squarespace.com/Phil or use the QR code. Because whether you're launching a business or a lucrative side hustle, your website is your digital business card. It's the only space where you control the story, no algorithms or distractions. And with Squarespace, it's so easy because they got a ton of stunning professional templates with drag and drop editing that makes site design incredibly simple, no coding required. So get started for free at squarespace.com/Phil or scan the QR code on screen and use code Phil for 10% off when ready to launch. Squarespace.com/Phil.